As the CEO, I often flew coach incognito to observe my airline, but on this flight, a simple red hat provoked a confrontation that my own crew escalated into a federal incident. The familiar scent of jet fuel and recycled air always brought me a strange sense of comfort. It was the smell of my life's work. From the ground up, I'd built this airline, starting with 2 rickety propeller planes and a dream. Now, we were one of the largest carriers in the country. And yet, here I was, crammed into seat 28B, my knees pressed against the seat in front of me, just like any other passenger. I make it a point to fly coach at least once a quarter, unannounced. It's the only way to see the real state of my company, to experience what our customers experience, without the polished yes sir performance my staff puts on when they know the CEO is on board. Today I was wearing a simple pair of jeans, a polo shirt, and a plain red baseball cap. It was a gift from my late father, a mechanic who spent 40 years fixing engines. He'd given it to me years ago, a MAGA hat, telling me, "Son, never be ashamed of believing in the country that gave us everything." I wasn't much for politics, but I wore the hat to remember him. To remember the grease on his hands, the pride in his eyes. It was a piece of him, a piece of my own story. To me, it was just a hat. As I settled in, a flight attendant came down the aisle, her smile as bright and artificial as the cabin lighting. She was making her way through the final boarding checks, her eyes scanning the rows. When her gaze landed on me, the smile faltered. It was just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. A subtle tightening around her eyes, a slight curl of her lip. She looked at my hat, then at me, and then her professional mask was back in place, but it was thinner now, more fragile. "Sir," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. "Can you please make sure your bag is all the way under the seat in front of you? We need to keep the aisle clear." I glanced down. My small leather briefcase was already tucked neatly away, with inches to spare. "It is," I replied calmly. She leaned over, making a show of inspecting it. "It needs to be all the way under. We can't have any part of it sticking out. It's a safety hazard." Several passengers in the surrounding rows turned to look. I felt a flush of mild embarrassment. I simply pushed the bag an extra half-inch, a meaningless gesture. She straightened up, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to the people in my row. "Wouldn't want that big, important hat to get scuffed if we have to evacuate, right?" She winked at the woman in the aisle seat next to me, who offered a weak, uncomfortable smile in return. I didn't react. I've dealt with far bigger egos in boardrooms. A flight attendant with a chip on her shoulder was nothing. I chalked it up to a bad day. We all have them. I put in my earbuds, leaned my head against the cool plastic of the window, and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest on the flight to Chicago. The peace didn't last long. As we reached cruising altitude, the same flight attendant began the drink service. Her name tag read, Brenda. When her cart reached my row, she served the 2 passengers beside me with a cheerful demeanor, laughing at a joke the man in the aisle seat made. When she got to me, her face went flat. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. "Just a coffee black, please," I said. She sighed dramatically, as if I'd asked her to brew it from scratch. She grabbed a paper cup, slopped some coffee into it from the carafe, and practically shoved it at me. A bit of the hot liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling onto my hand. I flinched, but said nothing, quickly wiping my hand on a napkin. "Careful," she said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want you to get all worked up. Your kind seems to have a short fuse." That was it. That was the line. This was no longer about a bad day. This was a targeted, unprofessional attack on a paying customer. My blood didn't boil. It turned to ice. All the years of building this company, of drafting mission statements about respect, professionalism, and customer service, all of it was being mocked and degraded by this one employee. I watched as she moved down the aisle, her demeanor instantly changing back to saccharine sweet for the next row. The man in the seat next to me, a young guy in a hoodie, leaned over. "Dude, what's her problem with you?" he whispered. I just shook my head, my mind racing. I could make a scene. I could demand to speak to the lead flight attendant. I could wait until we landed and file a formal complaint that would undoubtedly get lost in a sea of paperwork. But none of that felt right. This wasn't just poor service. This was a symptom of a deeper problem I needed to understand. And to understand it, I needed to see just how far she would take it. My opportunity came about an hour later. Brenda was chatting with another flight attendant near the galley, their voices low but their laughter sharp. A passenger in the row ahead of me pressed his call button. Brenda approached with a look of pure annoyance. It was an elderly man who politely asked if he could have a blanket. Brenda's response was loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Sir, if we gave a blanket to everyone who was a little chilly, we'd run out. You should have dressed in layers." The man, clearly embarrassed, just mumbled, "Oh, okay, sorry to bother you." As she walked back past my row, she caught my eye. She stopped, a malicious glint in her eyes. She gestured vaguely toward the old man. "See?" "Ah," she said to me, her voice laced with venom. "Some people just expect a handout. They think the world owes them something for nothing." She looked pointedly at my red hat. "Sound familiar?" The cabin was quiet. Everyone was listening now. This was no longer a private spat. It was a public shaming. She was using me as a prop in her personal political theater at 30,000 feet. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for my reaction, daring me to challenge her. My entire company, my father's legacy, my own principles. It was all being tested in this cramped metal tube. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I met her gaze, my face a perfect mask of calm. Then, I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't open an app or start recording. I just held it. I looked at her, my voice low and even, but carrying a weight she couldn't possibly comprehend. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your full name," I said. "And your employee number, if you don't mind." A wave of stunned silence rolled through the nearby rows. Brenda's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, and then a condescending laugh. It was a short, sharp bark that was somehow more insulting than her words had been. "My employee number? Are you serious?" She glanced around as if to share the joke with the other passengers. "You want to file a little complaint because your feelings got hurt? Go right ahead. You can find a form on our website. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a job to do." She turned to walk away, dismissing me as if I were a piece of lint on the upholstery. "I'm not asking for the website," I said, my voice still quiet, but now it had an edge of steel that made her freeze. "I'm asking you for your name and your employee number. Federal regulations require you to provide them when requested by a passenger for the purpose of a formal report." I was bluffing slightly. While they are required to have ID, forcing them to recite it on the spot isn't a hard and fast rule. But it was about the principle. It was about seeing if she knew the difference between her personal opinion and her professional duty. She clearly didn't. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She spun back around, her finger jabbing the air in my direction. "You are harassing me," she spat, her voice rising in pitch. "I am a flight attendant on this aircraft, and you are creating a hostile environment. I feel threatened." The young man next to me audibly scoffed. "Threatened? He just asked for your name, lady." Brenda ignored him, her eyes locked on me. "I'm going to have to ask my purser to come speak with you." She stormed off toward the front of the plane, her movements stiff with indignation. The cabin buzzed with whispers. The woman across the aisle gave me a sympathetic look. I simply sat back, took a calm sip of my now lukewarm coffee, and waited. A few minutes later, Brenda returned with an older woman whose name tag read Sarah. She had the weary but firm expression of someone who had broken up 1,000 in-flight squabbles. She was the lead flight attendant, the purser. "Sir," Sarah began, her tone measured and professional, "my colleague informs me that there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," I replied, looking directly at Sarah. "Your colleague spilled hot coffee on me without an apology, made derogatory comments about my kind, publicly shamed another passenger for requesting a blanket, and then made a pointed political statement insinuating that people who look like me are lazy and expect handouts." I recounted the events calmly, factually, without emotion. Sarah listened, her eyes flicking from me to Brenda. Brenda, for her part, looked like she was about to explode. "He's twisting everything. He was staring at me from the moment he got on board. That hat is a symbol of hate, and it made me feel unsafe. He was aggressive when I asked him to move his bag." It was a masterclass in deflection and victimhood. I almost had to admire the sheer audacity. Sarah held up a hand to quiet Brenda. She turned back to me, her professional mask firmly in place. "Sir, we are on a full flight, and emotions can run high. On behalf of the airline, I apologize if any of our crew's actions were perceived as unprofessional." It was a classic non-apology. "As a gesture of goodwill, I can offer you a $100 voucher for your next flight with us." I shook my head slowly. "A voucher isn't going to fix this, Sarah. This isn't about me. It's about a standard of service and respect that every single passenger on this plane deserves, regardless of what they're wearing or who they voted for." I still need her full name and employee number for my report. Sarah's patience was clearly wearing thin. Sir, I'm trying to resolve this amicably. Brenda is a valued member of our team. I'm not going to have her harassed. Asking for the information needed to file a report is not harassment, I stated plainly. That's when Brenda saw her opening. Her eyes widened, and a single theatrical tear welled up and trickled down her cheek. He's scaring me, Sarah, she whispered, her voice trembling. When he asked for my number, he leaned in, his voice got all low, and he said I had no idea who he was and that he was going to make me pay for this. The lie hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The entire dynamic shifted. The young man next to me started to protest. That's not what he said at all. But Sarah cut him off with a sharp look. Her expression toward me hardened instantly. The words threat and make you pay have a very specific, very serious meaning on an airplane. Protocol took over. The customer was no longer right. He was a potential security risk. Sir, I need you to stay right where you are, Sarah said, her voice now cold and official. She pulled out her own device and began tapping on it furiously while speaking into a handset connected by a cord. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the grave look on her face. Brenda stood behind her, a look of vindictive triumph dawning in her tear-filled eyes. She had won. She had successfully weaponized corporate policy and political prejudice against a customer she didn't like. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched the system I had built, a system designed to empower employees to provide legendary service, being twisted into a weapon against the very people we were supposed to serve. After a moment, Sarah ended her call. She took a deep breath and faced me, her face unreadable. Sir, I have spoken with the captain, she said, her voice formal and devoid of any emotion. Given the nature of the alleged threat you made against a crew member, he has made the decision to alert ground control. For the safety and security of this flight, law enforcement will be meeting our aircraft at the gate in Chicago. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. You are to remain in your seat until authorities come aboard to escort you off the plane. The announcement landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding seats. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now staring openly, their faces a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and suspicion. In their eyes, I had been instantly transformed. I was no longer a middle-aged man in a red hat. I was a threat, a problem, a man who was about to be met by the police. Brenda's look of triumph was sickening. She had played her hand perfectly, escalating a customer service dispute into a security incident. She stood slightly behind Sarah, her arms crossed, the picture of a wronged victim who had been bravely defended by her superior. The lie she told was so blatant, so destructive, yet in the rigid, protocol-driven world of air travel, a flight attendant's claim of a threat, no matter how fabricated, trumped everything. Sarah avoided my gaze, busying herself with checking her tablet, her demeanor now one of brisk, impersonal efficiency. She had made her call, and the consequences were now out of her hands. The rest of the flight crew, who had surely heard the commotion, gave my row a wide berth. I was radioactive. The young man next to me was fuming. He leaned over again, his voice a furious whisper. This is insane. I heard everything you said. You never threatened her. I'll tell them. I'll be your witness. I appreciated the gesture more than he could know. In a moment where I had been judged and condemned by the very people who wore my company's uniform, this complete stranger was offering to stand up for the truth. I gave him a small, grateful nod. Thank you, I murmured. I may need that. But I knew a passenger witness statement would be a pebble against a tidal wave. It would be my word and his against the official report of 2 crew members. In that equation, the crew almost always won. For the final hour of the flight, I sat in absolute silence, a pariah in my own sky. I didn't read. I didn't listen to music. I just stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. There was anger, of course, a deep, cold fury at the injustice, at the sheer unprofessionalism of it all. But beneath the anger was a profound sense of disappointment. I had failed. Somehow, somewhere along the line, the culture I had tried so hard to build, one of integrity, service, and respect, had eroded to the point where an employee felt empowered to lie and weaponize security protocols to win a petty argument over a hat. Brenda wasn't just a bad apple, she was a symptom of a sickness in my own company. As we began our descent into Chicago, a different flight attendant made the landing announcements. Brenda and Sarah were nowhere to be seen. The tension in the cabin was palpable. When the wheels touched the tarmac with a familiar jolt, no one moved. The usual scramble for bags was replaced by an uneasy quiet. Everyone was waiting for the show to begin. We taxied to the gate and the jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off. But instead of the usual announcement to deplane, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Chicago O'Hare. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until instructed otherwise. The authorities will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. Thank you for your cooperation." Every head in the front half of the plane swiveled back to look at me. I could feel the weight of their stares. I met a few of their gazes, my expression unreadable. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even nervous. I was resolute. This was no longer just about a flight attendant and a hat. This was a moment of reckoning for my entire company. The main cabin door hissed open. I saw two figures in the dark blue uniforms of the Chicago Police Department step onto the jet bridge. They were followed by a man in a sharp suit, carrying a tablet. He looked like an airport official, or perhaps a member of our corporate security team. They boarded the plane, their presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone on board. Sarah appeared from the galley, her face pale, and pointed discreetly towards my row. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, started walking down the aisle. The passengers shrank back in their seats to let him pass. He stopped right next to my seat, his shadow falling over me. The other officer stood a few feet behind him, his hand resting near his sidearm. The man in the suit stood at the front of the cabin, observing. "Sir," the officer said, his voice low and firm, "I'm Officer Miller. I'm going to need you to come with me." I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply unbuckled my seatbelt. "Of course, officer," I said calmly. As I stood up and moved into the aisle, Brenda emerged from the galley. She couldn't resist one last look, one final moment to savor her victory. She met my eyes, and a small, cruel smile played on her lips. It was a smile that said, "I won. You lose. You don't mess with me." I held her gaze as I turned to follow the officer. The man in the suit at the front of the plane looked from me to Brenda, and then down at his tablet. His eyes widened slightly. He looked back up, a sudden flash of panic and recognition dawning on his face. He took 2 quick steps forward, his mouth opening as if to shout something. "Wait, that's—" he started, his voice cracking with urgency. But it was too late. Officer Miller had already placed a firm hand on my arm, preparing to lead me off the plane in front of all my fellow passengers. And just as he did, my phone, which I had placed on the empty middle seat, lit up. It was a preset alarm I'd forgotten about. The screen glowed, displaying the notification in large, bright letters that were perfectly visible to the young man sitting by the window, and to anyone else who happened to glance over. It read, "Quarterly review call with David Richardson, head of in-flight operations." The young man in the window seat next to me, the one who'd offered to be my witness, saw it first. His eyes darted from the phone screen to my face, his jaw slackening in disbelief. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. The name David Richardson meant nothing to him, but the title, Head of In-Flight Operations, was unmistakable. He pointed a trembling finger at the phone. "Dude, are you—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his brain struggling to connect the dots. My little alarm was insignificant to the police officer, who was focused on his task. "Let's go, sir," Officer Miller said, his grip on my arm firming up. But the man in the suit, the airport-based manager, who had now seen my phone, was practically vibrating with panic. He rushed down the aisle, stumbling over a passenger's outstretched foot. "Officer, wait! Stop! There has been a terrible mistake," he stammered, his face ashen. He held up his tablet, frantically tapping the screen. An organizational chart was displayed, and at the very top, under the title Founder and CEO, was a picture. It was my official corporate headshot, the one from the annual report. It was me, just in a suit and without the red hat. Officer Miller paused, turning to the frantic manager with an annoyed expression. "A mistake? We received a report of a security threat made against a crew member. That's not a mistake. That's a federal offense." No, you don't understand," the manager gasped, shoving the tablet forward. "Look, this is Mr. Sterling. He's Arthur Sterling. He owns the airline." The name dropped into the silent cabin like a bomb. Arthur Sterling. A name that was on the side of every plane, on every ticket, on every employee's paycheck. It was a name that, within this company, was practically legend. The silence was shattered by a collective intake of breath. The officer's grip on my arm vanished as if he'd touched a hot stove. He took a half step back, his eyes wide with shock as he looked from the tablet to my face. Brenda, who had been enjoying her front row seat to my humiliation, went rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a ghastly pale mask of horror. Her triumphant smirk dissolved into an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Sarah, the purser, looked as though she was about to faint. She leaned against the bulkhead for support, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir." The local manager, whose name I now remembered was Mark, sputtered. "I am so sorry. I had no idea. The crew reported a disruptive passenger making threats. They never mentioned—" He trailed off, realizing he was only digging a deeper hole. I turned my gaze slowly, first to Sarah, then to Brenda. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet authority in my tone was more powerful than any shout. "A disruptive passenger?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Is that what you call a customer who has been verbally abused, condescended to, and then lied about? Is this the new standard of service for Sterling Airlines?" Sarah began to stammer an apology, but I held up a hand to silence her. My focus was entirely on Brenda. She was trembling now, her eyes darting around the cabin as if looking for an escape route from the airplane, from the situation, from the catastrophic consequences of her actions. She had picked a fight with a random passenger in a MAGA hat, and it turned out he was the one person in the world she couldn't afford to provoke. "Brenda," I said, her name tasting like ash in my mouth. "You told your purser, and she in turn told the captain, that I threatened you, that I said I would make you pay. Those are your words, are they not?" She could only manage a pathetic, choked nod, tears of terror now streaming down her face. These were not the calculated, theatrical tears from before. These were real. "Officer Miller," I said, turning to the stunned policeman. "This young man in seat 28A was a witness to my entire interaction with this flight attendant. I would like for you to take his statement. I would also like to request a cockpit voice recording for this flight, as well as the audio from the purser's call to the captain. I believe you will find a significant discrepancy between what was said and what was reported." Officer Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable, just nodded. "Yes, sir, we can do that." I wasn't finished. I looked back at the crew. "Mark," I said to the trembling manager, "get David Richardson on the phone. Now. Conference me in. Use your device." To Sarah and Brenda, I said, "You two are not to leave this aircraft. You will wait here." The atmosphere on the plane had transformed from a tense crime scene to an impromptu corporate execution. Passengers were now recording everything on their phones. This story was going to be everywhere in a matter of hours. I didn't care. Let them see. Let the whole world see what happens when the principles a company is built on are forgotten. Mark fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. After a moment, I heard the familiar voice of my head of in-flight operations. "Mark, what's going on? We got a security alert from Flight 1138. "David," I said, my voice carrying through the silent cabin. "It's Arthur." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a shocked, "Arthur? What are you doing on that plane? Is everything okay?" "No, David," I said, my eyes still locked on Brenda, who looked like she was about to shatter. "Everything is very much not okay. We have a problem with our culture, a big one, and I want you to hear about it directly from the employee who just demonstrated it so perfectly." I took Mark's phone and held it out toward Brenda. "Go on," I said, my voice soft but utterly unforgiving. "Tell the head of your entire division what you did." Brenda stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. The disembodied voice of her ultimate boss, a man she had likely never spoken to in her life, was waiting. The entire cabin, a jury of over 100 strangers, was waiting. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. The defiance, the smugness, the political righteousness, it had all evaporated, leaving only the raw, pathetic core of her fear. I, she stammered, tears and mucus streaking her face. "I made a mistake. I misinterpreted. The hat." "The hat," I repeated, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "So let me be clear for Mr. Richardson. Your professional conduct is dictated by a passenger's choice of headwear. You are trained to profile, mock, and then fabricate security threats against customers based on your personal political biases." From the phone, David Richardson's voice was sharp and horrified. "Brenda, is this true? Did you falsely report a threat to the captain?" She broke down completely, her words tumbling out in a torrent of panicked, incoherent sobs and excuses. "He asked for my employee number. I felt threatened. It's been a long week, and people with those hats are always so aggressive. I just assumed. I panicked. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It was the confession everyone had been waiting for. The young man in 28A shook his head in disgust. Several other passengers murmured their disapproval. The truth, raw and ugly, was finally out in the open. That's enough, I said, taking the phone back. David, you heard her. This is not a mistake. This is a catastrophic failure of professionalism and integrity. This is an employee who not only failed to do her job, but used our safety protocols as a weapon to punish a customer she disagreed with. This put the flight, the crew, and every passenger on this plane in a compromised position, all to settle a personal score. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in, not just for David on the phone, but for every employee standing in that aisle. And you, Sarah, I said, turning to the purser, whose face was a mask of regret. You had a chance to de-escalate. You had a chance to listen, to investigate. Instead, you took the path of least resistance. You trusted your colleague's lie over a customer's calm, factual complaint. You failed to lead. You failed your crew. You failed the passengers. And you failed this company. Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She knew I was right. David, I continued into the phone, I want Brenda and Sarah suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. I want you to personally oversee it. I want every passenger on this flight to receive a full refund and a formal apology from my office, not a voucher their money back. Their time was wasted and their safety was trivialized, and I want the statement from the witness in seat 28A to be the lead document in your investigation file. Officer Miller, I said, looking at the policeman, if you would be so kind as to facilitate that. The officer nodded curtly, already pulling out a notepad. My justice was corporate, but it was swift and absolute. Finally, I addressed the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice resonating with an authority no one could now question. My name is Arthur Sterling. On behalf of the airline that bears my name, I am profoundly sorry for what you witnessed and experienced today. This is not who we are. This is not what I built. The actions of these crew members were an embarrassment to the thousands of dedicated professionals who work for Sterling Airlines and strive every day to provide you with safe, respectful service. I promise you, this will be a lesson that is learned and never forgotten. I ended the call with David and handed the phone back to the shell-shocked manager, Mark. I then turned to the young man who had stood up for me. I reached out and shook his hand firmly. Thank you, I said sincerely. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when it's not your fight. You showed more integrity today than some of my own staff. What's your name? Leo, he said, still looking a bit starstruck. Leo, I said with a nod. I'm sure we can find a way to show our gratitude. Don't be surprised if someone from my office reaches out. With that, the incident was over. The police took Leo's statement, and a ground crew finally came to escort a weeping Brenda and a silent, shamefaced Sarah off the plane. The passengers were then allowed to deplane, many of them stopping to nod at me, some even murmuring "thank you" as they passed. They had seen a gross injustice, and they had seen it corrected in the most dramatic way imaginable. I was the last passenger to leave my plane. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I took off the red hat. I looked at it for a long moment. It was just a piece of cloth and thread, a memento from my father. It represented his belief in hard work, in building something, in the simple, bedrock values he'd taught me. Values of treating people with respect, of judging them by their character, not their clothes. Today, that simple hat had exposed a rot I never knew existed within my own company. It had started as the worst flight of my life, but it had ended up being the most important. It showed me that no matter how big your company gets, no matter how high you fly, you can never afford to lose sight of what's happening on the ground, or in my case in seat 28B,